Okay, so again, Donna, thanks so much. That was a pretty lengthy introduction, but I know of a lot of you, and a lot of you know me. But it is a pleasure to be here today. I want to, again, thank Donna and the Lake Hopatcong Foundation for inviting me to do this presentation. And as Donna pointed out, we're going to be covering a lot today. So fasten your seatbelts. There's a lot to take in. Honestly, I could probably spend a half a semester going over what we're going to go over in about 50 minutes. But we are going to, talk about lake ecology. I'll give you an introduction and really focusing on the things that define lakes and the quality of lakes. And we're going to learn a little bit also about that term eutrophication, what that means, the whole process behind it, and why it's important as those of you that are lake managers or those of you that live around lakes, the importance of understanding what eutrophication is all about. Really, over the entire course of my professional career, this has been my mantra. You just can't treat the symptom or react to the symptom. You need to take the time to identify and correct the cause. And I'll use a quick analogy. All of us at some point in time has had a fever. And that fever is really a symptom of an illness. But as you all know, you can have a fever for a lot of different reasons, but the correct medicine or the correct treatment that's needed needs to be first. You can't go take some medicine and expect to get better unless you understand what's really made you sick. And the same thing holds true with lakes. It's real easy to have like a knee-jerk reaction to algae blooms or to weed growth, but those are just symptoms. It's symptoms of eutrophication, that word again. But in order to manage a lake successfully and to restore a lake, you really have to take the time to dig in and identify what's causing these problems, and then put your effort into correcting those causes, not just reacting to the symptoms. So we're going to start with the basics. And in New Jersey, a lake is defined as a water body that's greater than 10 acres in size. And as probably the majority of you know, most of the lakes in New Jersey were formed by damming a stream, a river, or a wetland, resulting in what's called a surface water impoundment. Now, those are probably the two similarities that's shared by all lakes. The majority of them are dammed impoundments, and lakes are bigger than 10 acres. But from there, things go a lot different for every lake. And you just can't say a lake is a lake is a lake, because each lake is definitely a little bit different than another. And it's all because of the function of these various types of interactions. There's attributes about lakes. There's physical, hydrologic, biological, and chemical interactions. And all those interactions, they work together and independently to define the status of a lake. And we know that things change from season to season, and we know things change from year to year. But to really understand what makes your lake tick, you need to understand each of those attributes, collect the right types of data, and then understand how those attributes are interacting with each other over time. So I'm going to dig into this in a little bit in the next few slides, but we will look at physical, chemical, biological, and hydrologic properties of lakes. I'm going to start off with the key physical attributes. So just like us, we're oftentimes defined by height, weight, and age. And with lakes, they're going to be defined by maximum depth, average depth, total surface area, volume, and clarity. In addition to that, as I'll point out, a little bit when we start talking about hydrology in a little bit, we need to understand the watershed area. And the easiest way to sort of like in your head think about watershed is to think of your watershed as a funnel. And the perimeter of that funnel is basically the perimeter of your watershed. And every single drop of rainfall that falls within the perimeter of your watershed or that funnel that drains to your lake has the potential to end up in a lake. So, understanding what your watershed area is important. And then again, when we talk about hydrology, we'll talk about the importance of understanding that ratio between the size of my watershed and the size of my lake. In addition to that, a lot of times we need to pay attention, particularly for a lake like Lake Hopatcong, which has a lot of coves. It's very dendritic, oak leaf shaped in a way. The shoreline, the complexity of that shoreline is another one of those physical attributes that comes into play when we try to start managing our lake. But the 5 key parameters, what I call the must-know physical attributes of a lake, are maximum depth, average depth, area, volume, and clarity. So how does Lake Hopatcong stack up? Well, all of you know that Lake Hopatcong is the largest lake in the state. It covers 2,686 acres. It has an average depth of 18 feet and a maximum depth of about 58 feet. And it holds at capacity about 7.5 billion gallons of water. It's a lot of water. The average clarity of the lake, as measured in the middle of the lake, and this is average, is about 2.1 meters, which is roughly about 7.5 feet or so. The lake's watershed area is 13,500 acres, and when you look at that watershed to lake area ratio, it's about 5 to 1. So every 5 acres of watershed equates to 1 acre of lake surface area. The lake has a really long and lengthy shoreline, 44 miles in total. In addition to that, okay, we can look at some of these physical zones, and here's some terminology that all of you should be familiar with, and if you're not, you should become familiar with. I want to get a little bit more into the littoral zone because it's an extremely important physical zone of a lake, but that's essentially the lake-land interface. The limnetic zone is the open water area, and that's where it's typically deeper than you're going to find any submerged plants. So water depths in the limnetic zone are typically too deep to have submerged plants. And why? It's because of the euphotic zone. And the euphotic zone is essentially just that portion of the lake where light can penetrate to a given depth. And if I have a very shallow lake, say that's only about 6 feet in depth, my euphotic zone may cover that entire lake bottom, even if it's 200, 300, 1,000 acres. In Lake Hopatcong, the euphotic zone, if we go back to this slide, you see the clarity is only 2.1 meters on average. So what that means is that the euphotic zone is basically restricted to water depths that are about 2 meters or a little bit more at times, a little bit less at times. In addition to that, and just to keep in mind also, in that euphotic zone, that's where you're going to get all your photosynthesis occurring, okay? Whether it's out in the middle of the lake in the form of algae and phytoplankton, or if it's closer to the shore in the form of mat algae, floating plants, emergent plants, as well as phytoplankton. The benthic zone is another often overlooked, physical zone of a lake, but there's a lot of really cool things that happen within that benthic zone. As organic material filters down and rains down to the bottom of our lake, whether it's dead plants and algae or fish or whatever other type of organic material that's within the lake, there's a whole bunch of bacteriological processes that occur at the bottom of the lake that converts that organic material back into carbon. And then the vital building blocks for photosynthesis, phosphorus and nitrogen. So there's a lot that goes on in the benthic zone of our lakes. But those are basically the 4 important zones that you need to have in mind. As I said, the littoral zone is a very special zone of all lakes and ponds. It's that land-water interface. There's a whole bunch of really neat things that go on within that littoral zone. We're going to find baby fish. We're going to find adult fish spawning. We're going to find wading birds, turtles, and frogs, and a whole bunch of different forms of life, as well as emergent plants and floating plants, algae, and phytoplankton. It's an extremely dynamic area of our lake, and there's a lot of energy exchange, again, that occurs within that zone. Unfortunately, it's typically the area that gets first impacted by development. And, people want to clear right down to the edge, mow down all that vegetation so they can have views, they can have access or whatever. But in a lot of ways, there's a tremendous amount of damage that occurs to the lake, ecological damage that occurs And part of our goal in managing lakes is to restore all of those processes that are occurring within that littoral zone. We'll talk about that, towards the end of the presentation. But keep in mind that's a very important zone and one that typically gets abused tremendously and gets impacted by development. And then water column clarity, I think some of you have worked with Secchi discs, and basically when you lower a Secchi disc into the water column, that point just where it disappears, well, that defines the euphotic zone. That's just where there's enough photosynthesis, enough light rather, for photosynthesis to occur. You can also look at it from the standpoint of how water clarity not only defines how much photosynthesis is occurring, but how lakes heat up. And so the clearer a lake is, the further down radiant light can penetrate, and that means it starts to have an impact or some type of an effect on how a lake warms up or cools off. As we all know, the clarity of a lake can be affected not only by phytoplankton and algae, but by the density of plants, turbidity in the form of suspended sediment that may come in during a storm event, or like the erosion of the lake shoreline because there's no littoral zone any longer. And if you're down in South Jersey, our lakes down there tend to be a little bit more brown, but that's natural coloration. That's because of humic properties, humic compounds rather, that are in the lake and give it that brownish tea color effect. But all those things impact clarity. Okay, so we've looked at some of the basic physical attributes of a lake, and we're going to turn to hydrology. And hydrology, although it may sound simple, lakes are filled with water, but this is something that is often overlooked. This is one of those attributes that people oftentimes don't understand the importance of how a lake's hydrology really affects the lake's quality. Basically, what we're talking about is, over time, the amount of water that enters and the amount of water that leaves. And that simple rate of water entering and water leaving has a big impact on the quality of our lakes. Obviously, it affects the rate and the amount of nutrients and sediments that enter our lake on a daily basis, monthly basis, or an annual basis. As I'm going to talk about in a minute, it also affects how those nutrients, those vital nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, can be assimilated by plants and especially by algae. And it also affects the rate of how sediment settles and accumulates, and as a result fills in and makes some sections of our lakes shallower than others. And that's all a function of hydrology. We know this varies seasonally. We have wet times of year and we have dry times of year. And we know that it varies annually. We have wet years and we have very dry years. So hydrology is very dynamic, and it's a very important but often overlooked lake attribute. And this is why I think a lot of times not enough effort is put into understanding the hydrologic cycle of our lakes. There's a lot that goes into figuring out where all this water is coming from, and there's even more that has to go into figuring where all of that water goes out. But, as lake managers, that's what we do. We have to take the time to figure out water in and water out. And the reason for that, this gets back to assimilation of nutrients. That affects what's called flushing rate, or the inverse of flushing rate, residence time. And basically all that is, again, is just a balance between water in and water out. I think if you want to look at it in the most simplistic manner, if I pulled the plug on my lake, like I'm pulling the plug on my bathtub, and I drained all the water out of that water body, okay, my flushing rate could actually be defined by the amount of time that it would take to fill that lake back up, okay? So it's the amount of water that's entering. Once we fill up the lake, we fill up our bathtub or fill up our bucket, then that water exchange, water enters, water leaves, that starts to define that residence time, how quickly water is moving through my system. And as I mentioned, that all, varies seasonally, it varies annually. A lot of it has to depend not only on local climatic conditions, but the degree to which our watersheds have been developed. And as our watersheds become increasingly developed, the amount of runoff that enters increases, because when we get a rain event, that water no longer is going into the ground. It's not getting absorbed and utilized by vegetation. It hits pavement, and there's no place for it to go other than to run off, and it ends up in our lakes and ponds. So getting back to flushing rate and residence time, remember the two terms are, they're not interchangeable. One is the inverse of the other. But if I have a short residence time, it basically means that I have very quick flow through. So I have a lake where water comes in and water leaves pretty quickly. If I have a long residence time, I have slow flow through. So water enters, and it takes a while for that water to get pushed out of the lake. And, as we'll see, and I'll kind of use these examples in this slide, that can really have a big impact on what's happening in the way of, in particularly, algae blooms in our lakes. So obviously, the more inflow that I have, the more water that's entering, the greater the potential is for it to mobilize and transport and bring in more sediment and more nutrients. So you think, okay, the more inflow I have, the more loading I get. And that's true. However, if my ratio of watershed to lake is really large, say 20 to 1 or 50 to 1, essentially what that means now is that my flushing rate is very quick, because I've got a lot of drainage, it's entering my lake, and it's pushing water out very, very quickly. So you can think of it almost sort of using a couple of different analogies, the difference between drinking water from a garden hose as opposed to drinking water from a fire hose. Yeah, there's potentially a lot more water that I could drink out of that fire hose, but good luck trying to, drink water out of a fire hose. Or, those of you that, when we could travel prior to COVID, you come off the plane, you're in Newark, you go down to the baggage terminal, and the carousel's running really, really quick. There's a whole bunch of bags on there. I want to find my bag and pick my bag out. Well, think about this, if you're a single algal cell in a lake. If I've got a lot of nutrients, which would be like the baggage carousel being full of baggage, and I'm looking to pull out of that water column some phosphorus, and that would be like my suitcase that I'm looking for. Well, if that water is moving quickly in and out of the lake, it's going to be difficult to assimilate, those nutrients. So fast flushing water bodies, even though they may receive a large amount of nutrient loading, tend not to be, in general, as productive as slow flushing systems, because the algae and the plants have much greater opportunity to assimilate those nutrients that come in. But you can see right away, okay, this one attribute about a lake, hydrology, how that's affected by the physical attributes of a lake, the watershed to lake ratio, and then in turn, how hydrology affects the biology of a lake. So again, the importance of taking the time to know your lake, know all of its attributes, but especially hydrology, which is often overlooked. Okay, and with that, we'll move into water chemistry. So we're moving along at a pretty good clip. One thing with water chemistry, what I'll start off with is talking a little bit again about physics of water. We all know that water, it's called like the universal solvent. And one really neat thing about water that makes it such a hospitable environment is that it has what's called a high specific heat, which means it takes a really long time for water to get cold. So it cools off very slowly. And then at the, conversely, it takes a long time for it to warm up. So even though, we may go from last week having like 80-degree air temperatures to this week where it's, in the 20s, you don't see those big changes in a short amount of time in water. Once water heats up, it stays warm and it takes a while for it to cool off. So it makes a very stable environment for life that lives in our lakes. Another really interesting thing about water is this relationship between the temperature of water and the density of water. So as is common with most other liquids, as a liquid cools, it becomes increasingly dense. But the really interesting thing with water is that it reaches its maximum density at 4 degrees centigrade. And as a result of that, that's why ice floats. Ice is zero, but it's lighter than the water that's a little bit warmer that's lying below it, 2, 3, 4 degrees. That water is denser and it's sitting lower. So that's why, an ice cube floats in your beverage of choice, and that's why lakes do not freeze from the bottom up. It's all a function of this thermal density relationship. But in addition to that, as we'll see, in these slides, these thermal interactions do play a really big role in what happens in our lakes going from season to season. So in the spring, typically the water column temperatures are fairly uniform from surface to bottom. And this holds true even in Lake Hopatcong being 58 feet deep. Come around March or April, I can go out and sample that lake as I used to, and find that the water temperature from surface to bottom may only vary by a couple of degrees. It's not that great. And with that, because the temperature is uniform, there's very little difference in density as you go from surface to bottom. So what's the significance of that? Well, what that means is that because density differences are nominal, you get a good windstorm, and that has the potential to totally mix the lake from surface to bottom. Even though it's 58 feet deep, that bottom water can be moved from the bottom to the surface, and you've got this big convection current that's occurring. And in the spring, we would define a lake that's got uniform temperature and uniform density as being non-stratified or unstratified. Come summertime, the surface of our lakes start to get warmer. Again, that's going to be defined by water clarity, the depth of our euphotic zone. How far can that radiant light penetrate down through that water column? And we've all experienced this. You jump into the lake, you dive into the lake off the side of your boat. It's really warm at the surface, and boom, you get maybe about 6, 8 feet below the surface, and it gets cold really, really quickly. Well, that's, again, a function of water heating up, water cooling, but it's more a function of density differences. So now you start to see how this comes into play with lakes. Because if the density difference between those warm layers and the cool layers become great enough, it starts to inhibit vertical circulation. So it's no longer possible for the water at the bottom of the lake to freely mix to the surface of the lake. And we get into a situation where we have what's called stratification. And that point, that break point where you go from warm water to really cold water is called the thermocline. Now, the density differences between a lake that can freely mix and a lake that is stratified, it may be defined by only about 3 degrees centigrade, 4 degrees centigrade at most. So if you have a warm layer, let's say in the middle of the summer, it's up in the 80s, and your deeper water is at 60 degrees, those two layers are not going to mix. And as I'll show you in a minute, that has significant impacts on the lake's water chemistry. So here we have, again, a physical sort of chemical type of event that's starting to have an effect on the overall water chemistry of our lake and also on the biology of our lake. So we can look at thermal interactions a little bit further. This is just terminology. A lot of you are probably familiar with this. When we talk about that warm upper layer, that's the epilimnion. That transitional layer where the thermocline exists, that's the metalimnion. In the deep portion of the lake that stays cold pretty much the entire summer is called the hypolimnion. Well, in the fall, what happens? Our days get shorter, the angle of the sun becomes greater, and the air temperatures start to cool. And what ends up happening is that the surface layers of the lake start to cool off. And then we reach a point, again, where we have uniform temperature from surface to bottom, uniform densities. We get a windstorm that comes through or a big rain event, and the lake turns over. And that turnover typically occurs in New Jersey and in lakes in late September, early October. And the significance of that is what ends up occurring when we have that stratified versus no. Well, let me go back to this. I'll talk about the significance of that in a couple of slides, but just to sort of give you a visual representation between stratified and non-stratified. We'll look at these next couple of slides. So here our lake has gone from a stratified situation to a non-stratified situation. That can be graphed and illustrated. So here now I've got my stratified lake on the top left-hand corner, okay? That's actually data from Lake Hopatcong. And you can see, in the middle of the summer, July, August, September, I go out into the middle of the lake, and there's an abrupt break that occurs around 8 meters or so, where the lake transitions from being relatively warm to cool. I have another relatively deep lake, about 6 meters deep. It's, so we're talking about close to 20 feet deep. But you can see in this lake, water temperatures stay uniform from surface to bottom throughout the entire summer, actually throughout the entire year. So this is a non-stratified condition. So getting into the importance of that, what ends up happening is that when you have this restriction in vertical mixing, that bottom water can't mix up to the surface any longer. Well, that inhibits the ability of the deep water to become reoxygenated. Almost all of the reoxygenation that occurs in lake water, it's not because of phytoplankton, it's not because of plants, it's because of the exposure of the water to the atmosphere. And think of it, it's almost similar to the blood in our capillaries when it runs through our lungs. As that blood enters our lungs, it's devoid of oxygen, it passes through our lungs, and through simple dissolution, it becomes reoxygenated. And the same thing happens with water. When it gets exposed to the environment, it absorbs oxygen from the environment, from the atmosphere rather, and that keeps the water column oxygenated. But if we segregate that bottom from the surface and we prevent that water from being mixed to the surface, we end up expending all of that oxygen down at the bottom because all of that bacterial activity that's occurring at the bottom of the lake is exhausting all of that oxygen. And as a result of that, we end up what's called anoxic conditions. And here in this graph, again, this is Lake Hopatcong data, showing you essentially in the middle of the summer how oxygen levels below the thermocline drop off radically and actually approach close to zero, if not zero at times, the anoxic condition. So the significance of that, again, from a water chemistry standpoint and from a biological standpoint, is that when we have no oxygen down at the bottom of our lakes, all of the sediment-bound phosphorus, iron, manganese, and other types of minerals, the majority of that comes out of the sediment. It goes into solution, and we end up pulsing in a lot of phosphorus in that anoxic layer. So when a lake turns over in the fall, and you see a bloom occurring, like in late September, early October, that's a function, again, of hydrology. It's a function of, water density differences and, physical properties of water. But it has a resounding impact on the chemistry of the lake. And as that phosphorus moves from the deeper unlit layer into the euphotic zone, now all the algae that's up there in the euphotic zone, they're greeted with a big food source, and they can take advantage of that because the water column's still pretty warm, and you get a lot of photosynthesis, and you end up with that late summer, early fall bloom that is very characteristic of lake turnover events. So again, understanding all of these interactions and how they affect our water body. Okay, a little bit more about water chemistry, and we'll get more into like the, some of the things that, that define lake productivity, moving from chemistry into biology. But as I pointed out, lake water chemistry, it's going to vary seasonally. It's affected by hydrology, temperature, and biology. What's happening down in the benthos, that's a biological attribute of your lake, and that's affecting how your water chemistry is reacting. So as lake managers, again, and this is why it's important, when you have a lake, you just can't say, well, what happens in Lake Hopatcong is similar to what happens in Culver Lake or Lake Mohawk or whatever. Each lake is very, very different. So before I can go out and manage a lake and figure out how to restore it, kind of, again, getting back, what's to the root cause of my problems? I need to collect a lot of data. And so that's why, Princeton Hydro, Dr. Fred Lubnow, spend a lot of time and effort trying to figure out what's going on by collecting data and then using that data to guide us along the path of what needs to be done to restore the lake. So some of the important water quality parameters, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these, but again, clarity, as I mentioned before, water temperature, we measure that on a routine basis, dissolved oxygen, the lake's pH, how acidic or how alkaline it may be, alkalinity and hardness, which is essentially a measurement of how hard that water is, how much mineral content it has, phosphorus, nitrogen, and chlorophyll. For lake managers, we need to spend an exorbitant amount of time figuring out how much phosphorus is there, because phosphorus is the driving nutrient that establishes the overall productivity and basically how green my lake is. So here's some general water quality guidelines. And I think, this kind of like covers, no matter where you are in the state, some of these minimum let's call them minimum type of threshold values you want to see. You should want to see at least 4 milligrams of oxygen in your lake. And in a deep lake like Lake Hopatcong, it's going to be natural for there to be no oxygen down at the bottom. But if I have a shallower lake, I definitely want at least 4 milligrams of oxygen, because that defines a healthy environment for fish. Temperature, except for like cold water fishery lakes or lake like Hopatcong, where we have a multi-story fishery, we tend to want, in New Jersey at least, uniform water temperatures, no stratification. So we can have uniform temperatures from surface to bottom, and then good oxygen from surface to bottom. Lake clarity, we definitely want at least 1 meter. It's what I call the toe wiggle test. So if I walked out, sort of like chest deep in the water, if I can look down and see my toes and wiggle them, then, that's pretty good. And for New Jersey, that's not bad, but you'd see at Hopatcong, typically we have about double that, 2 meters. We want no more than about 0.05 milligrams of phosphorus. Why? Because number one, the state threshold, or the state standard for phosphorus in lakes is 0.05. But anything over 0.05, and in some cases even as little as 0.03, is enough to stimulate an algae bloom. And then when we talk about chlorophyll, we want our chlorophyll concentrations to be under 20. Why? Chlorophyll is essentially a measurement of the amount of productivity. That's a photosynthetic pigment that's in all phytoplankton. And once we get above 20, our lake is looking pretty green. Once we get above 20, we're not going to pass that toe wiggle test. Our clarity is typically going to be less than that 1 meter threshold. So normally we use 20 micrograms per liter as our threshold for chlorophyll A. So we'll look at some of these parameters really quickly. As I mentioned, in terms of dissolved oxygen, as we all know, we need oxygen in lakes. That's the just for us, as it is for us. We need oxygen to support all of the aquatic biota, especially fish. The oxygen levels in our lake, will vary somewhat because of photosynthetic activity and also because of ecosystem respiration demands. The more organic material, the more oxygen that is going to be consumed, and especially at night when we don't have any photosynthetic activity. Oxygen, as I mentioned, is going to be supplied primarily by atmospheric oxygen. So, as the water body mixes by wave action, by wind action, and vertical mixing, that's where the majority of the oxygen gets back into our water body. But some of it, yes, will be produced by plants and algae. When plants and algae photosynthesize, the byproduct of that is oxygen, and that's a good thing. And then loss of oxygen is going to be associated with respiration. Fish are respiring, they're using oxygen. Benthic decomposition that uses oxygen. So again, similar to water in, water out, this is DO in and DO out, dissolved oxygen being supplied and dissolved oxygen being utilized. As I mentioned, phosphorus.
Steve, it's Don. I just want to let you know we're about 10 after.
Good, we're right on time, thank you.
You're welcome.
So with phosphorus, this is definitely the nutrient that we need to spend a lot of time figuring out. Where is all this phosphorus coming from? How does it vary seasonally? We know that some of it is internal, which I just showed you how that occurs because of the lack of oxygen at the bottom of our lake. But the majority of it, like in a lake like Hopatcong, is going to be external. It's coming in with stormwater runoff. It's coming in with septic, effluent, even really well-functioning, perfectly functioning septic systems still pulse in phosphorus into our lakes. So it's important to understand where all this phosphorus is coming from, how it varies seasonally, how it varies annually. And again, as a lake manager, what I need to do is, once I understand where all this phosphorus is coming from, quantify it, and then that becomes like sort of my root cause of how green my lake is becoming. So at the end of the day, what I'm trying to do is minimize how much phosphorus enters my lake so that I don't get as much productivity, I don't see that, as much greenness in my lake. So as I mentioned, phosphorus sources, there's both internal and there's external. But for Hopatcong, and I would say 80% of all the lakes in New Jersey, stormwater runoff is critical. And because we develop our watersheds, that leads to a lot more stormwater runoff. And with that, we end up with a lot more phosphorus loading. When I say direct, what I'm talking about are piped sources of runoff into the lake. And indirect would be overland runoff, what washes in over our lawns, for instance, or through surfaces that don't have a pipe connection. And then other sources, septic systems, even direct rainfall, there's a little bit of phosphorus that enters. Here's a tidbit for all of you. Some of you have probably heard me talk about this in the past, but 4 Canada geese in the matter of one day produce as much phosphorus as 1 septic system. Okay, so let that sink in. 4 geese equals 1 septic system when it comes to phosphorus loading. So you can see why we sometimes as lake managers, we get obsessed with trying to figure out how to reduce that goose-related phosphorus load. And then as I mentioned, chlorophyll A, this is another very important measured parameter. And to kind of like simplify things, it basically tells us how green our lake is. Because chlorophyll is present in all synthetic, all plants and algae that are photosynthesizing. That includes cyanobacteria. They have the ability to photosynthesize. And so understanding how much chlorophyll is present in our lake gives us an assessment, a clear assessment, a quantifiable assessment of how productive that water body is. And this graph just shows you, again, it's biology and water chemistry kind of like interacting. As my amount of chlorophyll, which would be the amount of algae in the water column, starts to increase, my clarity starts to go down. So the blue line is clarity, the green boxes represent chlorophyll A. And so you can see, as I go from April through September, I get a peak in chlorophyll A in the middle of the summer, as we would expect. And that's when I experience the least amount of clarity. And it's all a function of productivity. Gets back to water chemistry and how that links then to biology. All right, and with that, we can try to transition into the biology of lakes in eutrophication, which is a biological process. So, biology of lakes, just as the case when we're talking about hydrology or water chemistry or something as simple as the temperature and density of water, again, it's very complex. And a healthy lake is a very complex, biologically balanced ecosystem. We need to have phytoplankton, algae, zooplankton, fish, all of the different organisms that are living in our lake, all working together in a balanced, holistic manner. When one of those things gets out of whack, then what ends up happening is the water quality of our lake suffers, and then we as users cannot recreate or enjoy the lake to its fullest extent. And the majority of the problems that come about as a result of too much nutrient loading, resulting in too much phytoplankton and algae growth. And that in turn, we go back, we can talk about that as an increase in productivity. And that is essentially an acceleration of the eutrophication process. So as I mentioned, I mean, you think of lakes, sometimes you'll see very simplified food chains, but there's a whole bunch of things that are happening in a lake. And all of these little interactions can have a dramatic impact, not only on the biology of the lake, but on the water chemistry of the lake, and in turn, how well that lake can be utilized by us for recreation or just in terms of its aesthetics. And that gets us into eutrophication. But as I said, it's a biological process. It's a natural process. There's nothing wrong with eutrophication. It's when that eutrophication gets accelerated. And when it gets accelerated, we have more primary producers, more plants, more weeds, more algae. And as a result of that, we start to see these problems, manifested in the form of very dense weed beds in very high concentrations of algae, in harmful algae blooms. And it all comes back down to nutrients. The more phosphorus in particular that enters our water body, the more productivity. And the more productivity, all that translates to is more algae. So although it's a natural process, it definitely gets accelerated when we start to develop our watersheds. And it's actually a process that we can control. We have the ability to control the rate of eutrophication. So again, just some simple terminology. A lot of you, again, are very familiar with this. We go from a oligotrophic lake, which has very little productivity, so it's extremely clear, to a highly eutrophic lake, which is very, very productive, and it's very turbid. It doesn't have a lot of clarity. And all of that, as I mentioned, is accelerated by watershed development, because as we develop our watershed, we end up routing more stormwater into our lakes, and with that stormwater comes more pollutants. So, yep, here's a typical oligotrophic lake, crystal clear, but there's not really much going on in here. There's not a lot of productivity. There's not a lot of nutrients, so the base of our food chain is relatively minimal. And as a result of that, it can't really support, an extensive fishery. So, overall, although these are crystal clear and they're very pretty, biologically, there's really not a lot going on in an oligotrophic lake. Eutrophic lakes, on the other hand, yes, they're very productive. And again, all that productivity is a function of nutrient loading. Now, here's Eutrophic Lake A. You can see this is pretty good. This is actually Cranberry Lake. It's pretty. I would have no problem going there and swimming. Here's Eutrophic Lake B. Now, that's pretty bad. That's what you don't want to see in your lake. I'm not going to tell you what lake that is, but what I will tell you, though, is that the difference in phosphorus concentrations between this lake and this lake is not as much as you would think. In fact, the phosphorus concentrations in both of those water bodies overlap, and they overlap significantly. The big differences are some of the hydrology of one water body compared to the other, in the timing of phosphorus loading, and also how much internal versus external phosphorus loading is occurring. But here we have, Eutrophic Lake B, which is pretty bad. We never want to see our lakes looking like that. And this is why we have to control eutrophication. And as I said, we've been getting back just to that common theme, figuring out the root cause of our lake's problems. We know, phosphorus is sort of like the bad guy. More phosphorus, more productivity. But at the same time, we just can't stop there. We need to take the time to thoroughly understand. This is Lake Ecology 101, biology, hydrology, chemistry, and the physical properties of that water body, because all those things interact to define how much productivity we end up with in the long term. But that phosphorus concentration and that phosphorus connection is really a big deal. And so that's why, we gravitate always to that end product, because that is what we can really manage effectively. The tipping point for excess productivity, as I mentioned, we can use 0.05 as like a threshold value, but anywhere depending on your lake from 0.04 to 0.07 milligrams per liter of phosphorus, we're talking parts per million of phosphorus, very little phosphorus, is the tipping point where you might see a lake go from being Eutrophic Lake A to Eutrophic Lake B, but understanding all of the other things that are happening in the background to establish how much productivity we have. And you've probably heard, Dr. Love now, use this or talk about this, that 1 pound of phosphorus can create or generate or support about 1,000 pounds of algae. So again, it doesn't take a lot of phosphorus to create some big problems. Now, one thing I do want to emphasize, because I hear this a lot, eutrophic lakes are not dead lakes. They're absolutely not dead. The problem is they're overly productive. And they're basically lakes that need to go on a diet. And like us, when we start putting on a few pounds, we say, I'm not that healthy any longer. I need to go on a diet. Well, for lakes, you need to put a lake on a phosphorus diet. And the bad news is that most of the state's lakes are eutrophic. A lot of it has to do with how those lakes were formed in the first place, but also the majority of it has to do with watershed development and the constant influx of phosphorus into those water bodies. But keep in mind, a eutrophic lake is not a dead lake. It's just a lake that needs to go on a phosphorus diet. And again, when we look at those symptoms of eutrophication, what are we looking at? Weed growth, algae growth. But our goal as lake managers, my goal as a lake manager has never been to get rid of all the weeds, get rid of all the algae. It's to basically put all of that back into balance, because yes, they provide, a really important attribute of our lakes. I mean, they're the base of the food chain, they're producing oxygen, provide habitat. The algae get consumed by zooplankton get consumed by the smaller fish, et cetera, et cetera. And, getting back to that littoral zone, having, a reasonable weed bed along our shorelines help keep that shoreline stabilized. That transitional area, as we're going from lawn to lake, if we have various types of wetland plants that are there, like an aquatic filter, a buffer strip, that helps to intercept and filter out pollutants. So you can see where weeds, can be a bad guy at times, but they're fundamentally important for a very healthy lake. But sometimes, they need to be controlled. There's no getting around that. But again, this is just evidence of way too much eutrophication and way too much productivity. But if I go back and take a look at why has this all occurred, the root cause is going to be too much phosphorus. And then what is probably exacerbating that are factors that are related to the lake's hydrology that enables sediment to settle out with that phosphorus to settle out. The lake doesn't flush that quickly, so it's more prone to be stratified. So there's all these things that are happening in the background that are defining that degree of productivity that you start to see. So we're going to summarize, and I think we're right on time, so we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. Lakes, complex organisms. A lake is not a lake, is not a lake, is not a lake. You can't say that one lake is exactly the same as another. They're very complex. They're defined by a whole bunch of different interactions. We understand that when we're trying to manage lakes, we're focused on that eutrophication process. But eutrophication, the fact that it is a function of excessive phosphorus loading, that puts us in the driver's seat. That's something we can control, so we actually can control the rate of eutrophication. But again, keep in mind that a eutrophic lake isn't a dead lake. It's a healthy lake that just needs to go on a diet. The success of your management plan and myself as a lake manager, it really comes down to understanding all of those dynamics that we went over. And even though, I gave you examples of like Lake Hopatcong and, thermal effects, I see those thermal effects in very shallow lake. A lake that's only about 6 feet deep has the potential to stratify. And I've seen many a lake that are in that range, 6 to 10 feet deep, that have a massive internal phosphorus load because they stratify, they go anoxic during those periods of, when there's no oxygen at the bottom. There's a lot of phosphorus that gets released from the sediment, and it's almost like throwing a bag of fertilizer into that lake. So even shallow lakes, we need to pay attention to those types of things. And all those biological interactions, what's happening along the shoreline, the benthos, phytoplankton, weeds, algae, that's all important. And, we just can't look at those as indicators of problems. We need to look at those biological interactions potentially as part of our solutions too. How do we balance all of that to make that lake function properly? So at the end of the day, successful lake management really gets down to taking the time to figuring out what's causing the problems and correcting those causes of the problems, as opposed to just reacting to an algae bloom or weed growth. And kind of like to beat this point home, phosphorus management is fundamental to successful lake management. And this is where the Lake Hopatcong Foundation comes in. The foundation has, been an important link between the community and the scientists and the engineers. Where everybody works together. We have this, like a day like today, where we're, exchanging information, and then you take that information home and you understand then what you can do maybe on your own individual lot to decrease phosphorus loading by being careful with how much fertilizer you're applying. Although our fertilizers should not have any phosphorus in it, you can get a lawn treatment company to come out and they may apply phosphorus-based fertilizer on your lawn. Putting maybe in a buffer, using a rain barrel, putting in a rain garden. These are all things that are being promoted by the foundation, and these are all things that collectively, help us restore lakes. Keep this in mind. Lakes don't go from being, a productive and healthy eutrophic water body to a messed up eutrophic water body overnight. Those things happen incrementally, and they happen incrementally as our watersheds get developed. So if you can reverse that process, okay, you can manage lakes and get them back into a condition that is very healthy. So what caused the problem in the first place can be reversed to actually help solve the problem. And that's where the foundation comes into play. So, you've got you can go to the foundation for educational outreach, materials like the Lake Friendly Living Guide. You have the Water Scouts. They've been promoting through grants and being able to get grants, things that are being done within the lake, like this year's phosphorus treatment by Princeton Hydro, the weed harvesting, other types of lake management actions that are being done to improve the quality of the lake, but primarily beat back eutrophication, get eutrophication under control. So for more information, I'm sure Donna can supply you with a whole bunch of information through the foundation. She mentioned North American Lake Management Society. It's a great source of information. It's a fantastic organization for technological transfer, taking scientific information and kind of like boiling it down for the masses and getting that across. And then people there like myself that are available to help. Same thing with New Jersey Coalition of Lake Associations. Some of you may not be familiar with the Federation of Lake Associations of New York, but go on their website. They've got a really cool document that you can download. It's called Diet for a Small Lake. And there's a whole ton of really good information. It kind of covers the things we talked about today. I consider it like a primer for lake ecology. And then finally, if you do have questions that go beyond maybe what you thought about today, you can always drop me an email. I'm really good at getting back to people via email. So feel free to drop me an email. And with that, I'll thank you very much.